Welcome, everybody, and good morning. Before my introductory remarks, I would like to note that today is National Aboriginal Day, so I'm very pleased to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to today. My name is Paul Bramett, and I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society, and I'm very, very pleased to have you here for the last of our summer lecture series. The Center hosts one series of lectures between September and April, and another series in the spring and summer. All of these sessions are open to the public, and over the years we've used a variety of formats, ranging from traditional 40-minute academic lectures to panel discussions to debates to artistic performances. These events allow us to showcase the work of our faculty and graduate student research fellows. We've also benefited enormously over the years from a very fruitful collaboration with the Anglican Diocese of British Columbia. We call the lectures and activities that emerge from that collaboration the John Albert Hall Lectures, after the fellow who donated the funds to produce these events. The aim of these talks is to host distinguished speakers from around the world who are engaged in work that is of interest to religious and academic leaders and lay people. We're always eager to vary the format of our public activities, and so late in 2017, one of our Anglican collaborators, Ian Alexander, proposed a series of moderated discussions with senior public figures of interest to both religious and secular audiences. In January of this year, we had the pleasure of hosting the first such conversation with Lois Wilson, former senator and former moderator of the United Church. The event was a great success, both in terms of the bridges it built between the university and the broader culture, but also in terms of the deep religious and political wisdom that Lois Wilson shared in her conversations with Ian. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome you to the second moderated conversation we are hosting with our Anglican friends. As in January, today's discussion will be moderated by Ian Alexander, who has a long professional career in broadcasting, first in the private sector and then for over 25 years at the CBC. For the last decade, he has maintained an independent consulting practice offering strategic counsel to media and cultural organizations. He is a lay canon of the Anglican Diocese of British Columbia and a parishioner at Christ Church Cathedral. He's also a lifetime senior fellow of Massey College at the University of Toronto. In the years I've worked with Ian on the John Albert Hall series, I've learned so much from him about the way media works and also about the life of the church, for which I'm both deeply grateful. Today, our featured guest is Bishop Remi De Roo. Every time I spend time with Remy or people who know him well, I come away feeling so grateful that my work allows me to be in the presence of people who have lived such full, rich, and inspiring lives. Bishop Remy is one of Canada's longest-serving Catholic bishops, a participant in Vatican II, a scholar, author, advocate on behalf of the poor, and a powerful critic of capitalism. Remi De Roo holds a doctorate in sacred theology from the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, Angelicum in Rome, and is the only living Canadian bishop to have participated in all 4 sessions of the Second Vatican Council. Considered a radical by some for his social views and reforming spirit, De Roo has clashed with popes and prime ministers in his efforts to champion the goals and the spirit of Vatican II. Speaking very personally, his remarkable 94-year life captures the kind of political passions, spiritual convictions, and intellectual curiosities that led me to McGill University to study religion under Bishop Remy's recently departed friend, Dr. Gregory Baum. As many of you will know, Remy has been involved with the University of Victoria in many ways over the years, but I'm just going to mention 2 that are relevant for us. First, for his 90th birthday, he asked his friends to give him a Bible. Now, look, as a former bishop, he probably has several Bibles and probably gets them all the time. But this is no ordinary Bible. In this case, Remy's friends gave him the large format, 7-volume St. John's Bible, a stunning contemporary artistic and cultural achievement. I'm delighted that Remy chose the CSRS as the home for this work of art. One of the volumes, this is volume 7 of the 7-volume set, is with us today. Regrettably, you can't touch it because it is just that valuable. But I've also brought with it something called the American Quran, which is a very interesting piece of kind of reinterpretive artistic work that is going to be part of a larger collection called the Found in Translation Collection. This collection will inspire many students, scholars, and members of the broader public in the years to come. I'm very pleased that really when you enter the center, the first thing you see is this collection. So Remy has really left his mark in the center in that sense too. Second, and in some sense most consequentially for us, Bishop Remy was instrumental in securing the lion's share of the center's endowment, with the help of many people, most notably the Van Kerkhoff family. It's therefore not an exaggeration to say that without his efforts, the CSRS would just not exist. You wouldn't be here, and neither would I. I would still be teaching in Winnipeg, so thank you. Not that there's anything wrong with Winnipeg, but if you had to choose, you know. So Bishop Remy, thank you so much for your ongoing contributions to the life of the center, to the university, and to our broader shared society. So please join me in welcoming Ian Alexander and Remi De Roo.
Thanks very much, Paul. Most of you probably know most of what I'm about to say, but just in case, let me say this. Remi Joseph De Roo was born on February the 24th, 1924, in Swan Lake, Manitoba. He was ordained a priest in 1950. He served as Roman Catholic Bishop of Victoria for 37 years, from 1962 to 1999. That same year of his episcopal consecration, he was selected as one of the youngest participants in the Second Vatican Council, whose cause and whose values he has championed ever since, and we'll be talking a lot about that today. Bishop De Roo served as the first chair of the BC Human Rights Commission from 1973 to 1977, appointed to that position by the late Dave Barrett, at whose recent memorial service Bishop Remy spoke. He also spent many years as chair of the Social Affairs Commission of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, and in that capacity, as Paul has already alluded, he was a strong advocate for the Church to speak and act on behalf of social justice, and we'll want to talk about that today as well. We've already been talking about it, in fact. Right. As some of you also will know, Bishop De Roo was never a stranger to controversy over the years. And the year after his retirement at age 75, a bitter dispute broke out over financial affairs in his former diocese. He was eventually vindicated after several years of legal wrangling. We may touch on that, or we may let bygones be bygones. We'll see how we go. In retirement, Bishop De Roo has continued to write and speak extensively. His 2012 memoirs, entitled Remi De Roo, Chronicles of a Vatican II Bishop, you may have seen copies of this on the table on the way in. Pearl, who is in the room there, would be happy to accept donations from anyone who would like to take a copy of this memoir home with them. So if you have picked up one or are thinking of picking up one, please see Pearl afterwards and make a donation to help offset the cost of these books. So Bishop, Vatican II, you describe yourself as a pilgrim of Vatican II. You've called it a time of euphoria for yourself. You've referred to it as a voyage of discovery that would radically alter your whole outlook on reality. So why did that church council 50 years and more ago now have such a profound impact on your life?
To begin with, let me make a brief comparison between how we used to study, what we would learn, and where we're at now in terms of Christianity, and specifically what we call theology, which means language about God, theos, logos. When I was a student in theology, to be oversimplifying, we began by looking at the present state of the church and how it's run, because we used those words in those days. Canon law was the summary of everything we were supposed to do and say, and so forth. We started from canon law, how things are going in the church. And then we used our theology basically to prove that we were right and all the others were wrong. And then justified that with quotations from the Bible. Text proofing, we call it. After Vatican II, we turned that upside down. Now we start from the Word of God. We use theology under the guidance of the Word of God to understand more fully the nature of our faith. And then we bring in canon law as a necessity to have order in the communion, in the assembly, because every gathering of human beings needs a certain consensus and a certain order, or you have chaos.
So there is one transformation or upending, if you will, of the order of things in terms of theological investigation and discernment. There's another aspect, I think, to Vatican II. You thought and think very highly of Pope John the 23rd. You refer to him as the saintly John the 23rd. And you say of him that his conception was to turn the Vatican, and by extension the church institution as a whole, from something very hierarchical and top-down to something, as you describe it, as circular, a gathering of equals, where all disciples learn and teach from and to each other. Is that
Correct.
Also an important part of the bouleversement of Vatican II?
Yes, certainly. John 23rd, the saintly John 23rd, whom I had the great pleasure of meeting personally, was also a historian. So, and I'll go at that from the anecdotal point of view.
Please. The story
One
is
day,
always powerful. Yeah.
John 23rd was discussing with one of his cardinals. And the cardinal was very downcast because of the unbelievably complex problems that he saw the church facing. And things got a bit gloomy. And Pope John said, "You know, my friend, I'm aware of these problems. But the church has survived. There have been other councils where the church has tried very hard to clarify and to respond to its mission. But in the final analysis, he said, you know, certain issues are only solved by funerals." So he pretty well called the bishops together and then turned them loose and said, okay, I'm calling it, but it's your council. And we started with that friendly understanding that we had a benevolent pope and that we were free to discuss matters as we saw fit. And we did.
Now here's the $64,000 question. And I put it in the context of what the Chinese premier of the day said to Richard Nixon in 1972 when the subject of the French Revolution came up, and Zhou Enlai said, "It's too soon to tell." And that was after 2 centuries. So 50 years and more on, kind of getting close to 60 years since the council was called in 59. Did Vatican II really change anything permanently in the church?
It depends what you mean by change.
And by church and by permanently.
Yeah. That the church is no longer, from the outside as we observe it, similar to what we had before Vatican II, I readily concede. However, I will argue, and we can discuss this further, for the fact that the church has not changed because the church is the visible embodiment here on earth of the Son of God who became flesh, lived among us, spent a whole life showing us how to live, because the early followers were known. You can look at the Acts of the Apostles. Paul himself recognized that he persecuted the followers of the way. The church is a way of life. And that way of life is still what it was before Vatican II and always will be. We have only to look at the 10 Commandments and even more than that, the Beatitudes, which is a charter really of what the church is all about. Now, as long as you see the church as institution and it must be, incarnate and visible in history, then you can understand it'll have its ups and downs, high points and low points. And some of them, as history tells us, have been very low. But ultimately, the church is the communion, the assembly, and the sharing together of all those who want to be disciples of Jesus Christ. And they have heard Jesus say to the apostles, go out into the whole world and pronounce the good news. Tell them about the kingdom, because the kingdom, I think today we would say rather the reign of God, which is more dynamic. But let's stay with the word kingdom. By the way, I'm told that it's used over 150 times in the Bible. So it's certainly one of the themes. And the Gospel of Mark begins with those words, you know. The reign of God is here. So in that sense, the church has been here for 2,000 years. And 2,000 years from now, we might just come back and have a look. We'll find the church is still there. Because the church is ultimately the living members of a person, Jesus Christ, who is not subject to death because he overcame the power of death and sin.
Do you see a distinction, though, or even a tension, if not conflict, between the church as the people of God, which is what we're talking about here, what you've just been talking about, and the church as a institution?
Yes, certainly. There has been and there always will be tensions. And that's the old issue which we discussed briefly before coming here, between the institutional incarnate dimension and the spirit, you might say, the prophetic dimension. There are those in the church who, by calling specifically, are meant to be prophets. I mentioned particularly the religious orders. And I want to say it now because I might forget. In terms of my personal experience right here on Vancouver Island as a council father, no one has made visible and incarnate the spirit of Vatican II better than the religious communities, specifically the religious communities of women. They have been and continue to be a prophetic voice, which we have to recognize, and of which I'm very proud, because I'm very proud to be associated with them in this work. And the religious men also, but we have less of them, of the men's orders. And there again, I have to say, the women certainly outshone the men on that score.
Do you think that, in fact, the orders of religious operating a little bit to one side of the ordained hierarchy, if I can call it that, have that ability to be more of a progressive and prophetic voice and force?
That's part of their calling. And by and large, I think I would recognize they have been pretty faithful to that mission.
Your involvement with one of the orders here on the island got you into trouble with powerful Cardinal McIntyre of Los Angeles at one point.
That's right.
One of several run-ins with authority that you've had. Could you share that story with us?
Yes, I will share this story, but I want to preface it by saying that whatever critical remarks you may hear me making are not meant with malice, and if they strike somebody in a painful way, I apologize in advance. But yes, facts are facts, and history is history. And Cardinal McIntyre didn't particularly like women, I think, and he didn't like the IHMs, the Immaculate Heart of Mary Sisters, when they left aside their habits and went into laid rest. And he basically wanted them to be good little girls, continue teaching in all his schools under his direction, and put on their habits and behave themselves.
And there were sisters in his diocese in Los Angeles, and there was a community here on Vancouver Island.
Yes, I was the only bishop outside of California who had the Immaculate Heart Sisters in his diocese. So here's the story. when I heard there was going to be an investigation of the Immaculate Heart Sisters, I wrote a letter to the secretary of the Pope's representative in the United States and said that since they have decided to have this investigation, I wanted to have a word to say. That letter wasn't acknowledged, but I got a call from Ottawa, and the Pope's representative in Ottawa, obviously in conversation with one in the United States, basically told me that I shouldn't meddle in this issue, and wasn't I risking my future, my career, by taking sides for this group of women, basically. But I held my ground, and the rest is history.
Do you sometimes wish that you had not been caught by the prophetic spirit of Vatican II, Bishop, get yourself into less trouble?
I must admit it was painful at the time, repeatedly. We may touch on that later on. But looking back today, no, I'm very happy that the Holy Spirit graciously used me as an instrument to try and restore justice in that particular situation.
Shift gears a little bit, because part of what, when we speak of prophetic Catholicism, we come to think very quickly about issues of social justice, as we've alluded to already, and that's been a theme through your career. What do you say to people who say, and I think there are lots who still say, the Church has no business meddling in politics?
Very good question. My first answer would be, have you read your Bible?
Care to elaborate on that?
Then I would probably go by speak a little more to him about the nature of politics. What is politics? And it's not just what we see around us. And here again, I respect politicians. I was asked at one time to become a professional politician. I turned it down. I thought it was more important to continue as a bishop. There's a Greek word behind that. Polis means the city, meaning the community, the extended family. So all of us, particularly since Vatican II, must be aware that since we were created equal in dignity and in capacity to serve, and have our sacrament of baptism to back that up, and we can come back to that, we're all called to be concerned for and involved in the pursuit of justice. The Bible tells us that Joseph was a just man. That's not a superficial statement. That really sums up the whole Bible. Because the whole Scriptures is about the order God put into the universe and how we human beings are to be administrators of that order and respect it. And here's where the whole question of the modern profession and support proclamation of what we sometimes refer to in simplistic words as the green world. Yes. We are responsible for Mother Nature, on whom we depend from the first moment of our existence, and part of that is the work of the household. The household in the broad biblical sense, at a time when the leaders were patriarchs and heads, chieftains, heads of tribes, etc. They were all responsible for everything pertaining to the well-being of the society over which they presided. So, political engagement is part of bringing about good order in society. In our prayers each day we say, Our Father, thy will be done, thy kingdom come, on earth as in heaven. Think about that. It's very serious. Heaven is not something that's going to happen in the by and by. Heaven is not something pie in the sky. Heaven is the beginning for each one of us individually and collectively of our relationship with the divine purpose which put us here in the first place. So really, we enter into that concept of being just and of worshiping God from the moment that we become conscious of who we are. Now, because we're human beings, naturally there's going to be tension between good and bad, order and disorder, belief and unbelief. And that's where the prophetic orders come into tension and sometimes conflict, as history has told us, with the established religion. By the way, you hear people say sometimes, well, I'm spiritual but not religious. Well, here again, we have to clarify what we mean by the terms. We are all spiritual. We are spirits in flesh. We are not body and soul, as the Greek philosophy would have us say. We should no longer use that expression. First of all, you cannot separate body and soul. So the spirit is spirit. It's intangible. And no one can change that. But we are all called to do the best we can to see to it that every human being can live a decent and comfortable life and do meaningful work and go about talking with others and together trying to build the best example that we can have here on earth of what ultimately heaven will be.
So let me take you back to the early 1980s, because you were in the thick of very much what you're describing now. You served for a long time as the chair of the Social Affairs Commission of the Canadian Bishops. And I think it was New Year's Day 1983 when that group published Reflections on the Crisis in the Canadian Economy. And it did cause quite a stir. And I was thinking back on the context of that. So John Paul II had published the encyclical on human labor a year or two before. And I was remembering back, we had an 18% mortgage at that time. There were financial challenges in the country and in the world. And you spoke out very strongly the bishop spoke out very strongly about that and got quite a reaction. Let me ask again, as I was asking about Vatican II, here we are 35 years later, and there is greater economic disparity now perhaps than there ever has been before, even more so than then. There is housing shortage and unaffordability. There is food insecurity. There are more children in this province living below the poverty line than ever. So once again, I have to ask this question. Have all of this action, all of this talk, has anything changed?
From the outside, if you can only go by newspaper headlines, I would say, no, nothing has changed. But on the basis of my own experience as a bishop here on Vancouver Island, I would say that we witness already, particularly since Vatican II, a rising tide of people of goodwill who have taken the message of Vatican II seriously, particularly the document on the church in the modern world, and are becoming more conscious, more vocal, and more empowered to do something about transforming society. So I remain optimistic while recognizing, terrible things are happening. But then let's look at our history. Our grandparents didn't have a picnic when they came to Vancouver Island. And there are continuing and have been difficulties and tensions. That's part of the struggle. But it precisely takes us back to the previous point, which you made so well. We're all responsible. It's not just a few elected leaders. And the first responsibility, of course, is to see to it that the people we elect as leaders are the ones who are most able and willing to lead us along the paths of justice.
So then the role of the church is not simply to provide charity, but to walk alongside and moreover to advocate for. Is that true?
Yes, the role of the church is not primarily to provide charity, but to provide and make sure that other people provide justice. If we just make handouts with money and possessions and all the wonderful instruments that are around us, and do not do something about redressing an unjust order.
So getting at the fundamental root cause.
The fundamental. That's no longer charity. Mm-hmm. We are stealing from the poor that which belongs to them as well as to us.
That's the prophetic voice.
And we should have more of those prophetic voices and prophetic actions from all the citizens. That's part of the whole thing of being equal in dignity and capacity to serve, and thereby equally responsible. Not all in the same task. There's a variety of responsibilities. But there again, we're back to the point, who do we elect to lead us in this domain of justice?
So while we're in the realm of electoral politics, tell us about being asked to be the first head of the BC Human Rights Commission by then Premier Dave Barrett. Was that a difficult decision for you to make?
It was a decision to which I responded, and the question that I responded immediately. I said yes. Because how could I, a bishop, be preaching about justice and human rights if, when asked to take on the responsibility of the Commission on Human Rights, I would refuse? I saw that as part of my mission as to be a bishop, not just in church, not just in the cathedral, not just visiting parishes around the island, but as a citizen and a Christian, doing the best I can in one of the most important issues right now, and that's the pursuit of human rights.
I think you were saying as we were coming in that first commission was instrumental in beginning the campaign for accessible buildings.
Yes, I'm very proud of that.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a down-to-earth, I feel, and a very practical thing, but it was our Human Rights Commission that got the government to accept as a policy that all public buildings would be handicapped accessible.
Did you ever run into any conflict between your role as Human Rights Commissioner and your role as Bishop? Not
really. No serious conflict. Sometimes there was tension over the problems, obviously.
I'll bet.
But by and large, I would say no. I was never asked why I would be there as a bishop. People took it for granted and accepted that. And I had a wonderful team of collaborators who put me to shame in some ways by the depth of their engagement and the sincerity of their purpose. I really learned to grow a lot myself.
Let's shift gears for a minute. We were speculating about this, and so I'll put the question to you now. Why do you think that so many churches, yours, mine, others, end up spending so much of our time, institutionally again now, worrying about issues of gender and sexuality?
Because the whole of society today is obsessed by that issue.
Want to say more?
Well, we see it all around. You've only to look at the newspapers. I think part of it also is the problem we face about respecting other people as the other. Because by and large, most people still want other people to be like they are. So we're constantly comparing, instead of recognizing the marvel of each person as a creation, a divine creation, and trying to help each person to become all that they are meant to be. The struggle will always be there, but it's a question of our maturing and accepting more and more of that responsibility. And here again, I want to say that I'm really impressed by the number of people whom I see, taking on more and more intelligent responsibility.
I think you've spoken a lot over your career about issues like the ordination of women. Any comments on that today? Where that?
Well, a little bit of history. Back in 1986, I was invited to speak at an international convention down in the United States. The exact place doesn't really matter too much, which was a gathering of some 2,000 women, a sprinkling of men who were there invited by their spouses, but it was basically a women's convention. And I had the honor of being asked to be one of the keynoters. And I said at that time, and I repeat today, the question of the ministries in the plural, the ministries of women in the church. I'm not talking specifically of ordination to the priesthood, which is one narrow slice of a vast and broad question. That issue was of such importance that it called for the combined, the collective spiritual discernment of the whole church, not just the hierarchy. That landed me in front of Ratzinger, later Pope
Indeed, another of
Benedict
your run-ins
XVI.
Another of your run-ins with authority.
Right. It was very painful because basically I was not respected as a brother bishop. He spoke down to me about obedience and things like that. He did not take the time to ask me, first of all, exactly what had been said. He was going by newspaper headlines, and why I had said what I said and the way I did it. We didn't have a fraternal conversation. I was basically scolded and sent off. And the pain there was that this was not what I would call collegiality, where brother church leaders come together and respectfully discuss with one another some of these major issues.
So I guess that's my question, going back to the spirit of Vatican II and a more circular or collegial, conciliar, whatever words we want to use. In this diocese, you took a very synodal approach to the governance of the diocese. But we don't really have that, do we, in the church as an institution? It remains a pretty hierarchical place, wouldn't you say?
We're working at it. I have to give credit here to the Eastern Church. The Eastern Church, as you know, is totally synodal. A bishop cannot operate without his people as reflected in their leaders, ordained or otherwise. And when we were into very hot and difficult discussions at Vatican II, we, the Western bishops, heard the Eastern bishops say that what we were struggling for and looking at and dreaming of, they already had and always had. They were synodal from the word go. When Jesus chose 12, that was a synod, a group. He didn't just go on his own. Now, the collegial dimension, and you use the word rightly, it means basically the same thing. Synodality, if I may use the broader expression, or conciliarity, these are all words which basically mean the same thing. They mean that things are done in communion, not just by isolated individuals.
But I think that then Cardinal Ratzinger said at one point, there is no canonical authority to councils. Canonical authority rests in the hierarchy.
Yes, he was taking position in a very difficult state, and I would not agree with that, because the whole tradition of the church, way back since the time of Paul, stands with the synodal concept. Paul himself definitely worked with groups. In fact, they are mentioned in the Bible, and incidentally, there's almost as many women as men, working with Paul. We must never forget that.
And leading those groups.
And leading those groups, absolutely. No question about it. We wouldn't describe them the same way as we do today because the canonical term ordination didn't even exist at the time of Jesus. And it was quite some time, historians will argue for a long time, and may never give us a full answer, but I give credit to those scholars, particularly the women who are exploring those days now. There was a time that there's a gap between the work of Jesus and Paul and other disciples and the establishment of the various forms of order which have followed after that. The threefold order of bishop, priest, and deacon did not exist immediately. And Jesus never ordained anybody. So we have to be careful now what we say and how we explain the terms that we are using.
I was talking with a good friend recently, and the nature of the conversation went like this. Sometimes conclaves make amazing decisions, and then curias spend decades backpedaling.
Well, first of all, I have to say I have great respect for the curia, just like I have great respect for the civil service. Yeah.
And in the same way.
Bishops and elected leaders come and go.
Yes.
The curia remains, the civil service remains. They have a steadying influence. And it's to be expected that there will always be tension between the curia, the structures, the laws, etc., and the orders, and the charismatic prophetic dimension. It's part of the human condition. We need both stability and creativity. And we should be grateful to the people who provide it. So, in all due respect, and leaving that as is, you have to expect tension, recognize that, and then trust the people in those various positions, different ministries, to do what is expected of them.
I made that comment because I guess I wanted to ask you whether you feel, as some do, that the present Pope may be progressive Catholics' best hope for the realization of some of the aspirations that one could trace back to Vatican II.
I have great admiration for Francis, and I must tell you a little story.
Please.
I was there about 3 years ago at the canonization of John the 23rd. Mm-hmm. And also, sorry, I had a blank here, and I lost the other name. That's part of being past 90. Anyway, I was in a wheelchair, and that got me close to where the Pope celebrated the Eucharist. And he had finished celebrating the Eucharist, and he was coming across an open space between us, himself, and myself here, and the Pope-mobile in which he was to embark and then tour St. Peter's Square. And I saw my opportunity. My voice carries well, so I didn't have to shout, but in my best Italian, in a clear voice, I said to him with my hand extended so he could see my ring, "I'm a Vatican Council father." Well, that stopped him in his tracks, and he turned and he came towards me with a big smile. And he said, "Oh, one of the few remaining Vatican Council fathers. Wasn't that a wonderful experience?" And he leaned over, took my hand, and kissed the ring.
Wow.
How often have you seen a Pope kiss a bishop's ring? With such intensity, and held on to it. Mm. It told me reams, a picture says more than words, about his respect for Vatican II. Combine that, he has the spirit of Vatican II in him, with also his Jesuit training, and use thereby of an expression I heard sooner than which you understand when I spoke about the combined communal spiritual discernment. That's part of the heritage of St. Ignatius. And that's very common today among leaders who understand that you need organization in structure to get things done. And you need to discern. In other words, listen to others, dialogue and study, and then find out in communion what is best and what the Spirit calls us to do. The common good is never found in individuals alone. The common good is always the gift of the whole community.
Do you have hope that Francis, that spirit that caused him to kiss the ring of Vatican II, can achieve over against the natural inertia of the civil service, to use that phrase? Or will they wait him out, Bishop?
We are moving. We are moving. I'll never forget what a missionary in Latin America said to me one time, talking about the peasants. We're talking basically about those human beings who are largely illiterate because they've never had opportunity to study academically. They don't have schools, etc. That doesn't mean they aren't wise. But they are awakening. This is one of the great things that's happening today, the awakening of the peasant movement, because they're very closely linked with the biblical understanding of the Bible. That's why what we call liberation theology was seen as such a threat, because people reclaimed the Bible and saw the story of God, the history of the church, and the church in history, which is also part of that, is right there in the Bible. Anyway, to come back to what he said, the peasants are awakening. They will make 3 steps back when faced with persecution and bloodshed, because they know that they don't have the power in their hands, and they know that most battles in history have been fought in the blood of the poor. So they'll step back 3 steps, but then, they'll step back 2 steps, but then they'll step 3 forward. They are moving. That movement is with us already. And there are more and more people, particularly people who have been associated with movements, what we one time called Catholic Action.
Yes.
Who are getting involved and who know that it's not enough just to hand out charity to people, especially when, as I mentioned earlier, we're using the goods that belong to them to give them charity. That's not charity, that's justice, and it can be robbery. We need an evolution of structures. And I'm not too concerned when I see structures crumbling, because that's part of history. Structures are the expression of culture. People build the structures they need to promote their culture, and cultures evolve. So the structures will do so, and that also is changing. But it's the people really, ultimately, in communion, working together, who will promote justice.
And I note just in passing that Francis seems to have taken some steps of reconciliation with figures in the liberation theology movement laterally, so that may also be a sign that you're such an optimistic individual, Bishop, I have to say. Do you never despair?
I haven't yet.
There's so many more things I want to ask you, and people I know in the audience want to ask you as well, but just before we open it up for questions, I said in my introduction, and the headline in the Globe and Mail in 2005 said, Bishop Deru vindicated. This was at the end of the financial controversy. Do you feel vindicated?
I really don't feel that vindication was necessary in the sense in which we frequently say, because it wasn't a question of right or wrong so much as a question of well-meaning people missing the boat And especially, I think what was most difficult for me, looking back now, was the fact that in all that, I was never consulted, never asked, now, what really happened? I was judged, and the books were, in a sense, closed on it. It was a very, very painful time, but I credit all the people who were involved in doing the best they saw with the information that they had at that time. But yes, it was a very painful experience.
And finally, just to pull back and even larger, we've touched on a few of your quote-unquote run-ins with figures of authority in the church. There was to be a reconciliation event at St. Andrew's Cathedral, which never happened. Do you feel reconciled to your own church today?
Well, once again, I don't feel that I ever left.
Maybe it left you a little bit.
Well, I'll let history and other people judge that. But I think all the people involved do the best they can.
And we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Bishop.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was really terrific, really, really rich. I hope at 54 I'm as sharp and as articulate as you are at 94, so thanks very much. So we have an opportunity now for about half an hour of conversation. We have two mics. Scott and Sally have mics. I'll kind of keep the speakers list casually, and we'll have an opportunity for some questions. Michael?
Thank you very much, Ian, and especially Remy. It's always wonderful to be in conversation with you. You have once again shown yourself as a wonderful leader and apostle of Jesus Christ. But there are other faiths in our global complex. And I wonder if you could share your reflections on how your faith relates to others. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a beautiful and very important, powerful question. The answer to that comes straight out of Vatican II. And here was one of the major, sometimes we call these shifts, not saying specifically changes, because when the shift is made, we often find that we're really back in the beginning, the early beginnings of the church, that we had just lost something and we reclaim it. I'll touch on that for just a moment. But Vatican II stated, particularly in the document on the Church in the Modern World and the document on non-believers, for instance, that here again, I ran into one of those blanks that often hit people. Would you repeat your question, please?
The question was about other faiths.
Yeah, thank you. That's all I needed. Thank you. That's great. Yeah, other faiths. Vatican II said that nothing that is true or just or beautiful is alien to the church. We stopped with Vatican II. We stopped declaring that the church was a perfect society and that we had all the truth and the others were all wrong. Instead, we recognized that truth with a capital T, capital truth, is beyond human comprehension. We must continue struggling to get as much as we can of truth. That's our responsibility for all of us. And we grow in our understanding of truth. And truth comes to us in many ways. That's why the church recognizes the other disciplines, science, mathematics, biology, especially today, philosophy, so forth, whatever. You can name all the different disciplines we presently have, and no doubt new ones which will come along, especially now with the opening of outer space. So, truth is always welcome. It's good to remember, if we read our scriptures, that someone once said, I am the truth. Someone once walked the world in the person of Jesus Christ. I am the truth and the life and the way, to come back to our earlier expression. So it's a question of evolution and growth. And the fact that the church can still have experiences like Vatican II and make the necessary accommodations is a sign that there is a lot of truth right there.
If I can just follow up on that and come back not even to other religions, but even within Christianity, what hope would you hold out then, because this was also a theme of Vatican II, for greater ecumenical cooperation and understanding and tolerance among denominations within Christianity?
I'm totally in favor of ecumenism and also of interfaith work and prayer together. It's moving. When I look back to what I knew as a child, as a boy, and as a student, and even as a priest, and what I know and experience now are worlds apart. And it's reason for real optimism. Here on Vancouver Island particularly, because as I look at what's happening elsewhere, I'm very happy and very proud of the people of Vancouver Island in terms of the progress that is being made on all those levels.
Well, perhaps it has something to do with your having seeded the ground. Let's go to another question, Paul. Yeah.
Hello. I bring greetings from Reverend Ron Johnstone. He says he used to do things with you, and he hopes you remember him. That's Reverend Ron Johnstone.
Yes, and your question?
Oh, I just wanted to bring the greetings from him and hope that you remembered him.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Remy, kind of related to Michael's question a little bit, but jumping off.
I didn't quite hear what the...
She was bringing greetings from Reverend Ron Johnstone.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Please give him mine. Thank you. Sorry that I missed you.
You had mentioned the question of reconciliation previously. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to your perceptions of the current state of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, because today is the National Aboriginal Day. That is one of the topics to which you've contributed a fair bit.
First of all, I'm very proud of the fact that shortly after my arrival in February of '63, the native peoples of the island, all 7 tribes, as I understood there were at that time, welcomed me and adopted me. I went through the ancient ritual, not just of being made an honor or something, which is wonderful in itself, but I have been adopted into the Aboriginal race on Vancouver Island with the beautiful name. I don't know if they were aware at the time when they named me that I came from a place called Swan Lake, because they named me as High Priest White Swan, alluding somewhat to my youth at the time and the fact that, if I understand right, that the swans come back to the island at a certain time of the year. So it just all fitted together beautifully. And I'm very proud of my name as Seam Le Plitspoken, and I try to live up to the expectations as much as I can. So I have nothing but appreciation for the Aboriginal peoples. And while we are making progress, we've a long way to go, and it's not going to be an easy way, because there are very profound cleavages there. It's a question ultimately of culture, and culture doesn't evolve rapidly. And it's very hard to understand someone else's culture if one has not lived that culture, because it's also a way of life. But also the fact that at this time, not only are the Aboriginal people in turmoil because of the terrible things that are happening, But we also, the non-indigenous, who are really indigenous from other places, if you will,
Settlers.
we too are in
settlers.
turmoil. We too are not clear in our own purpose. So I think part of the difficulty we have in our dialogue, and the dialogue is very necessary, and I'm glad it's going on, and part of the difficulty is that on both sides, if I may use that expression, and I don't mean that negatively, but on both sides, we too are in disarray and don't know where we're going at this point. That applies not only to history, but also to the church. You may have heard me use the expression, not only is the church in history, but history is in the church. The church of 2,000 years ago, culturally speaking, is very different from what it is now. So it's going to continue to require a lot of prayer, thoughtful reflection, and a lot of work together, a lot of action together for us to grow into a better understanding. So words alone are not enough. Money's not going to solve problems, sometimes makes it worse. It's really a willingness to understand one another better by living more and more like the other, and respecting the fact that we must ourselves honor the other as different, as other, not just because they're similar to us. It's one of the beauty of the mystery of the divinity and the whole universe, which is now unfolding before us, is that there are these millions of human beings and no two are alike.
I wonder whether one of the areas where we settlers can learn from First Nations is something you alluded to earlier, and that is finding right relationship with creation. And you were suggesting that yet another of these Vatican II threads is the theology of creation. And it seems to me that there is much to be learned from a First Nations approach.
There's very much to be learned from the First Nations and from all those who have learned to respect nature, because First Nations come from many nations.
You were speaking to me earlier about two views of creation. Maybe you could just elaborate on that for everybody. You were talking about two versions of the story.
Yes. There is creation taken as it's observable, as science sees it. And in that context, we could say that we are the stewards of creation, on which we depend totally. And there we must try to render creation as close as possible to the model of what we learn in the scriptures and in our own tradition and so forth. But then there's the other model of creation that arises not from our observation, but from the revelation of the divine. And we see that all of creation, which we admire, etc., is not something that we are free to manipulate as we see fit, but that all of creation is really a miracle of which we are part, and that we too come out of the primitive whatever, which was there at the start of time. And it's not enough, incidentally, to say that all of creation started from a point, because that ignores the question, who made the point?
Adela and then Graham.
Bishop Deru, yes, I'm sure you're familiar and appreciate Dom Helder Camara's statement from maybe the 1980s that if I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. If I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist. And I've been thinking of that in this past week and more, with the terrible crisis in the U.S. in the border of the child migrants who were being jailed, we'll say, for lack of a better term, and the fact that one photo of a little 2-year-old girl from Honduras has become rather iconic. And Honduras has been very much, excuse me, the thought of the little girl gets to me, that it doesn't take much to see that Honduras, the history of Honduras has been very impacted by American policies that have damaged it greatly and that have impoverished Honduras. And when there's great impoverishment, it's not a big surprise that there's a lot of violence. And now these people, like this 2-year-old girl and her mother, are trying to escape those places. So going back to that, well, all of the social justice and liberation theology, but as a Christian, how do we, like I'm on Facebook and I'm ranting and raving about the terrible treatment of these children, and then when you learn more about the history of Honduras, anyways, it's very hard to just kind of not be angry or something like that. Maybe my question is, how do you keep from being angry and totally stressed by these terrible injustice in these situations?
How do I keep from getting angry at the terrible injustice in Latin America? Well, may I start with a little bit of history? First of all, it's good to remember that not so many centuries back, there was a big argument in the Spanish court whether the natives of Latin America were human beings or not. Okay, in that sense, we have made some progress. I've been to Latin America. Helder Camara was a personal friend of mine. I'm looking for the day when he too will be put, in the role of honor, what we call canonizations. It's long overdue. But there's a very deep issue there in all of Latin America over precisely the question of the image of the human. There are too many leaders in positions of responsibility who do not respect other beings, as human beings made in the image of God, and consequently they do not treat them justly. And up until now, I used to hope that things were better in the United States. However, we are seeing that there are major problems. I won't go into the details. And we mustn't blame anyone else, because I think if we go to other countries, we'll find this problem is latent. It's very deep there. It has several forms. One of the forms is what we sometimes refer to as paternalism, whereby particularly white people, but others too sometimes, consider themselves as innately superior. So there is a very profound problem there. It's going to call for the change of the structures. I'll tell you a little incident. I was in Latin America talking with 3 of these so-called peasants, which proved to me that they were really very wise, even if they had not been to school. And having listened to them for a while, in my well-meaning naivete, and out of my own cultural position of somehow feeling that maybe, things were better in Canada than in Latin America, I dared, as I look back now, to ask the question, what can I do for you? What can I do to help you? The answer came back right away. Go back, go home, but then prove us from your Canadian base that what you call democracy really promotes and assists and respects the poor people of the world. That's one of the big lessons that I've learned.
Thank you.
It's not for me to consider that I am any better than anybody else, but I should show in my example, our democracy should show in its own example, that we are part of what is really best called the cause of the poor. Commitment to and engagement in the cause of the poor is the touchstone of the goodness or otherwise of our own democracy.
Thank you. Before we go to Graham, some of you will notice that there is a paper going around. If you are interested in the work of the Center and being informed about our upcoming lectures and events, please do sign that up, and we'll make sure you get informed. Graham.
Thank you, Bishop Remy, for your comment. I'm over here. Hi. Sorry.
Just speak up just a little bit.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, and I would love to be able to hear you every day to speak. It's been wonderful to hear. My question comes from the earlier one that Michael posed, and with regard to ecumenism and dialogue with other non-Christian faiths. When you spoke about the Vatican II document, Nostra Aetate, about relations with non-Christian faiths, it spoke very well. It's the kind of statement that any Catholic institution would post and be proud of in relating to non-Catholics, non-Christians. Since the Second Vatican Council, though, there were other statements made by leaders. So I'm sorry I don't have good English translations for it, but John Paul in the encyclical Redemptoris Missio in 1990, he spoke of the danger of relativism in seeing every other faith as being just as good as Catholic Christianity. And this got picked up again by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in the year 2000 with its document Dominus Jesus, and saying that those who are not believers in Catholic Christianity don't have the fullness of salvation and are in a gravely deficient situation. That's a near quotation. But then since then, Francis, the Pope, has in his exhortation Evangelii Gaudium put all that aside and spoke about the need to aim for justice and peace in the world as an aim of dialogue and ecumenism. So here's the point, or the question finally, and that is, given these very different views, say between Vatican II, a pope, soon-to-be pope heading a congregation for the doctrine of the faith, and then the current pope, what would you say to a Catholic person or persons who want to make sense of this difference and how to receive it?
Wow.
First of all, let's pick up the word relativism, which is being bandied around. Okay. And my question to that question is, what do you mean by relativism? Okay. And then my positive approach, we need absolutes. We need anchors, so we won't be drifting around. I'm all in favor of that. But where do we find the absolutes? First of all, we won't find them in science. We'll find relative truth according to the various sciences. But that's the observable and the changeable. Okay. Ultimately, we'll only find them in that which is beyond the human being. We need a reference point. However we find it, where we find it, or how we describe it, what we commonly refer to as God or the divine, or that great source or the great energy, the names are secondary to the issue. We need something outside of ourselves. But those absolutes are few. There aren't many. I won't go into that. That'd be far too long. Each one of us must seek the truth wherever we find it. But to speak of relativism while ignoring the fundamental question and the cause of justice is an evasion. So it's not the place or the time here to go into lengthy discussions. But you will find, if you look at the history of the church, there is a consistency on the part of the church of seeking the truth, the full truth, the absolute truth. And we know, this is a historic fact, that someone came into the world 2,000 years ago and made visible in a human being what the good and the true and the just and the beautiful looks like. So ultimately, the question is what we do, how we live, what is our way of life. And that's where you and I come into the picture. Each and every one of us is responsible for showing in our own lives and in what we do that we don't let ourselves become prey to what might be called relativism and act and speak as if it didn't really matter, what's true and good and just. Truth does matter. But the fullness of truth became incarnate in Christ Jesus, and we have his example and the scriptures to back it up, because we also have our sisters and brothers of the Jewish persuasion who tried to do their best to follow the Torah. Each and every one of us must do the best to follow that which we find is not relative, that which is solid and permanent. We're not going to find the fullness of that here on earth. We'll only find it when we come face to face with the author of truth. In the meantime, let's not, in a sense, diminish one another by saying, oh, that's just relative, and you mustn't be caught in relativism. And put that in a positive structure and say, each and every one of us is bound to pursue that which alone is not relativism, and that's the truth.
I wonder if I could just do a quick follow-up on that, Paul. Is there time for that?
Yeah.
Just staying in this general area of relativism and coming back to some of the things we were saying about Francis and recent developments. So, and you and I were talking a bit about this before, so let me just recap it and turn it to you to respond. Some of Francis's recent statements have been interpreted by some conservative Catholic thinkers to suggesting that we are going to, in effect, change doctrine through the back door of pastoral practice, so that we may, because we feel, as Francis has said, communion is not a prize for the perfect, but a powerful medicine and nourishment for the weak, so we would not deny the sacrament to a divorced person. Or we might, for pastoral reasons, wish to offer last rites to someone whom we know is seeking assisted death. And there are those who then say, this leads to a patchwork quilt of practice. I was a little bit offended. Some people said, this will take the Catholic Church down a path that leads to something like the Anglican structure, where practice in one part of the world may be quite different from practice in another part of the world, because that is the local culture. Now, surely that is relativism. Do you worry about that danger?
No, I don't. First of all, I want to pick up one little point. I know what you said and what you mean, but I don't want you to be misunderstood. It's not a criticism of Anglicanism. We of the current Roman Catholic Church have an awful lot to learn from the Anglican Church. I mean that. I'm serious. For instance, I saw this at Lambeth, where I had the privilege of being there in '68. And the celebration of the Eucharist, as I saw it performed by the hierarchy of the Anglican Church. Impressed me so profoundly that nobody has to ask me whether or not I believe that the Eucharist is valid in the Anglican Church. I saw it, I felt it, I experienced it. So, with all due respect, but we are on the question again. Pardon me, I had another one of these blanks that...
I can certainly say as an Anglican that the Anglican communion is quite rent asunder right now because of these differences of not only pastoral practice but
yes,
doctrinal belief.
Okay, I got my string of thought back. Yeah, the key word here, I think, is the word pastoral. And it's good to remember, Vatican II was a pastoral council. It did not argue over doctrine. So all the doctrine previous to Vatican II stands firm and will stand. Doctrine does not really change because ultimately when you push through the wall, doctrine is a person. Christ Jesus our Lord, risen, who sent us the Holy Spirit in Pentecost so that we might be inspired to live as he lived. But doctrine is preached to people down through history in various cultures. And the cultures differ greatly. And I fully understand, and it's something that I admire in the Anglican Church, is its ability to adapt to the cultures. The Roman Catholic Church has also done it in its own way. I'm not comparing that one is better than the other, but I'm simply saying that's one area where we have a lot to learn from the Anglican Church, particularly now with the so-called shortage of clergy.
Yes, and you've spoken on that issue too.
Yes.
You know, married clergy, for example.
Yeah.
We won't go there today.
Well, except to say, let's go back to the Bible. In the early church, when someone was designated as an elder, because that was the first form of ordination, elders and deacons, did anybody ask the candidate, are you married? Anyway, it's a complex problem. It's going to take time. But it needs a pastoral solution. This is part of the problem, you see. We're trying to solve the question in terms of law. We're starting by canon law. And I respect canon law. It's not issue. But the ultimate preaching of the gospel is a pastoral responsibility. So it's up to the pastors, the leaders, elected and appointed or ordained, however, to be truly pastoral. And I love the image from Francis, who says, it's not enough for you to go among the sheep. You must smell like the sheep.
Well, on that's a very rich metaphor to close. But with this interaction between Graham and Ian and Remy, I think that's a really wonderful way to end. Before we send everyone off to lunch, I want to thank Ian for suggesting this format. I think it was a really interesting way to understand Bishop Remy's contributions to Christianity in the region, but also his insights over his years. And thanks also to Bishop Remy for your role in founding the center, for the gift of the St. John's Bible, and for the kind of conversations you still stimulate. And we really appreciate that. You mentioned before that lives need anchors and people need anchors, and I think in some very profound way you are one of the anchors of the center. So thank you very much. Take care, everybody.